Good evening to one and all of you. Welcome to the third talk of the Development Discourse series organized by the Center for Policy Studies. Today we have a talk on Beyond Trump, Understanding the US Electoral Verdict and its Aftermath. I would like to welcome the speakers to the stage. First, I would like to welcome Professor Acknowledgements, Head of the Department of Center for Policy Studies, to this dais. Now we have Dr. Parthasarathi, Head of the Department of Humanities and Social Science. I welcome you, sir, to the dais. I would like to welcome Dr. Neelanjan Sarkar, Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, to the dais. Now we have Professor Uttara Sahasrabuddhe, Professor at Department of Civics and Politics, University of Mumbai. I welcome you to the dais. I invite Professor Acknowledgements for the welcome address. Thank you.
Friends, welcome to this Development Discourse series. Now we actually had decided on a different topic for this day, and that decision was taken before the US Electoral Verdict came out. So we realized that if we don't hold a talk on this topic in November, A, we would be unprofessional. B, if we do it in December or January, it will be too late. So I actually apologize to the other speakers who are going to come and talk about Narega, because that's something which you'll probably do it in January or February. But all of them said, no, we completely understand. Yeah, if we were you, we topic change kar dete. So I think that was some kind of indication. We have two speakers who complement each other. Neelanjan is a number buff, so he strayed into political science from electronics, I suppose. From maths. So, I mean, that will strike a chord among you here who also want to do this kind of straying. Professor Uttara Sahasrabuddhe is a more pakka political science person, but slightly contaminated because her husband is 81 IIT pass out. So she said, Acha, IIT, I know this. And if any of you have read Madhouse, you remember that there's this editor who is the wife. She said, I know these creatures. So she also knows these creatures. Professor Parthasarathi will be chairing this session, no better person than him. I'll just give a very brief observation of which I think you can think about it and request the speakers also to throw some light on this. We deliberately kept the topic as Beyond Trump because it's not, just that the presidential election was won by him. The Senate and the Congress also went to the Republicans. That's one thing. And it's not an isolated event in certain sense. You will be seeing a rightward lurch all over the world. And why this kind of change is happening, I think that's a larger picture that we need to take a look at. And I've been following a few of these things for a while. And it appeared to me that Pareto, of course it's unfashionable to talk of Pareto, though Partha tells me that often there is some interest in Pareto, because Pareto was actually called the Karl Marx of fascism, if I am not mistaken. And Pareto talks in terms of this rotation of the foxes and lions. There's a rotation of elites in the society, and the foxes and lions is the term which actually Machiavelli used initially. The very, very rough or simplistic description of it is like the lions who kind of come to the power, they ascend, And then gradually they get kind of institutionalized, sophisticated, ordered, and so on. So they turn into foxes. And then what happens is at some stage there's kind of disdain or dissatisfaction with these foxes, and new lions come and kind of knock at the door, push the door, or get crashed, and then they come in. And the typical feature is a disdain for all this streamlined flow, if I may use the word. I mean, all the establishment, all the sophistication and all that. And that is how the cycle goes on. Or you can say, evam pravartitam chakram. After French Revolution, it was not that after French Revolution there was a republic and the story was over. France actually went through republic, monarchy, and I remember Kettleby's Modern History of Europe, very interesting point that he makes is that when they switched over from republic again to monarchy, and there was some kind of not a survey in the present sense, at that time you didn't have psephologists, but generally someone went around saying, "Kyun change hua?" And the one predominant answer was ennui, that's boredom. The French citizen got bored with that republic, and they said, "Kuch boiled vegetable hota hai, chatpata masala chahiye," and that is where actually the monarchy has come again. So these kind of things do happen. Maybe speakers may not agree with me on this, but I think this is one point which we need to look at, and it also gives rise to hope that the lions will then again turn into foxes, and then eventually some new lions will overthrow them. Thank you very much. I must ask Neelanjan Partha to opening remark, and we will send a number cruncher as opening batsman.
Thank you. I did not, I must admit, imagine an occasion when I will be asked to chair a seminar on Trump. Of course, I thought I'd take advantage of the title, Beyond Trump, and suggest to the two speakers that we avoid any reference to Trump altogether in this talk. But then Satish has just said that there's no better person to chair this seminar on Trump than me. Okay, so then I'm not sure what exactly is my expertise on Trump, but let's leave that aside for a moment. Just to give you a brief background to the Policy Studies Center and its development discourse series as well, before we begin. So, as you're aware, the IIT Bombay started the Center for Policy Studies a few months ago. We started it as a virtual center with faculty members from various departments. As a research center and as a space where we could get visiting scholars, postdoctoral faculty members, as well as from time to time hold seminars and talks on topics of contemporary relevance. So this is the third in this series that you have to be having. Eventually, of course, we plan to have an academic program as well at the earliest, and we will be a full-fledged academic teaching and research center. So that's also some information for all the students here in case these seminars make you move away from engineering and get into a different dimension. Now it's needless to say that we live in a globalized world, but perhaps we have always done so. But events happening around the world have much more of an impact on other regions, other countries than it used to perhaps in earlier decades and centuries. And this is seen, in fact, in the large-scale interest that the rest of the world had in the US elections. Perhaps this kind of attention was not seen in earlier decades. And this is not just a reflection of the actors involved in the elections, but also of the fact that what happens in the US is likely to have such a large impact on the rest of the world in terms of economy, politics, war, peace, culture, what have you. So it's therefore we thought it apt that we should have some discussion about the post-Trump aftermath and its implications for the United States itself and for India and for the rest of the world. So with that intention, we invited two scholars to come and speak to us on this occasion. Dr. Neelanjan Sarkar from the Center for Policy Research, whose director Pratap Bhanu Mehta was here for the inauguration of this center, and Professor Uttara Sahasrabuddhe. So I will briefly introduce both of them, and then we will have them speak to us. Of course, we failed to get somebody from the United States to come and speak, but we do have a non-resident American, if I can call Neelanjan that. He is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania, but he's also okay. He's a U.S. citizen. That's okay. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. Among his research interests, it includes Indian political economy, comparative political behavior, and his mathematics background is clearly seen in some of his research interests on Bayesian statistics, causal inference, social network analysis, and game theory. His recent and current work is on state-level elections in India, where he's been using data analysis methods as well as ethnographic research. And he's also been working on characterizing the relationship between citizens in India and their local leaders, and how local leaders, both rural and urban, make political and economic decisions. He's also been involved in several large-scale data collection exercises that looks at the role of urbanization in changing social attitudes and behavior in India. So his bachelor's degree has been in applied mathematics and economics. He went on to do a PhD in political science from Columbia University. Professor Uttara Sahasrabuddhe is currently at the Department of Civics and Politics, University of Mumbai. She is the author of Antarrashtriya Sambandha in Marathi. She's also edited a book titled Emerging Issues in India's External Relations, and in addition has numerous other publications in various journals and book chapters. She also happens to be the senior articles editor of the Asian Politics and Policy Journal, as well as a visiting faculty at the Indian Navy's College of Naval Warfare. She's been the recipient of numerous fellowships, including the Asia Fellowship, as well as the Asia Fellowship Collaborative Grant. And her doctoral thesis was on Soviet-Indian relations under Ms. Indira Gandhi. So two political scientists speaking to us on Beyond Trump, Understanding US Electoral Verdict and its Aftermath. So we'll have Neelanjan going first, and then Professor.
Okay, so before I get started, I would like to thank CPS for inviting me. I am an American citizen. I grew up in the United States, but I actually don't work on American politics. I work on politics here. But this election has given me cause to sort of do some of the things I do in India, but apply them to the United States. And you'll see why I say that in a little bit. I also want to sort of lay the ground a little bit about where we are and what we know about the election. So the election has actually not been certified yet. So there is no publicly available data. So much of the data I'll be using will either be historical data, which I can access, or data that has been crunched by other sources, New York Times in particular. But you'll see, I mean, the sorts of numbers I use New York Times for are numbers that are pretty much agreed upon across sources. So, this is the reason why we're here today. We are here to study the emergence of Donald Trump. And before I sort of get started in detail, sort of to set some ground rules, Please feel free to interrupt me at any time, ask any questions, especially because I'm going through tables and things, so it's totally okay to stop and ask clarifying questions. The other thing I want to say is I'm not actually interested in why Trump won. I'm interested in why Trump was popular. So, I had written a piece in the Hindu before the election saying, well, Trump has already won because the election is close. Right? Now, had the election gone 2 percentage points the other way, maybe we wouldn't be doing all of these things, and certainly it has an institutional impact, but it wouldn't change the fact that Trump is massively popular. Right? So Donald Trump, what we know of him is that he at times would get fiery. But he also openly used language of the sort that has not been heard in the United States, or actually probably even in India, for decades. He's alluded to all Mexicans coming across the border as rapists. He has said that all Muslim immigration needs to be stopped. He now, in his brief time in planning for starting the presidency, has started planning out a Muslim registry. He has talked about stopping the H-1B program, which has brought a lot of Indian scientists to the United States. He has already appointed cabinet members that are openly associated with the white nationalist movement in the United States. So, irrespective of sort of where things go from here, there's no doubt that until today, there have been very, very strong what I would call nativist appeals made, right? Appeals made to the white majority, appeals made of an ethnic sort to the population. And the real puzzle we have here is that, if we think about Europe, if we think about the UK, there is a basis for nationhood, the Church of England. Think about France, it's language. The United States never had that. So, in some sense, it's quite surprising. So one of the things that I will talk about is how nativism is constructed in the United States, actually from race. There is a history of very poor race relations in the United States. But also using the United States to grapple with this larger problem, that Professor Acknowledgements talked about, this sort of rising nativism, this sort of rising move in the world, and what can our analysis of the United States bring to this problem? Okay, so I'm going to define nativism, in a very thick way. Nativism isn't just an emotional appeal for my ethnic group. Nativism actually means I want to control institutions for the benefit of a dominant ethnic group. So, in the United States, that is the white, largely Protestant population. And one can see, based on appeals that have been made for taking over the courts, banning immigration from various countries, that this is, a sort of appeal that has been made. So the question that I want to sort of ask, and I'm going to sort of develop a theory here, a little bit of a theory, is under what conditions does nativism generate a winning electoral strategy? And under what conditions is going to happen in the West? And I'm going to point to two things that we also see in the US, but I think we can actually draw the parallels to this to many of the Western European countries. So the first thing is there are a set of concerns that people have been raising for a long time, that the left seems to have given up on social welfare programs, welfare states, so on and so forth. And what I want to argue is that that is true, but it's a consequence of something that happened that is the major structural and demographic transformation in the West of the 20th century, which is the rise of a large middle class that no longer cares about these things. So when we think about politics in a democratic system, we need to have a form of politics, a set of appeals that are coalitionable. And what I mean by coalitionable, I need to be able to bring along sufficiently many people to my side in order to win the election. So in a world where a very large percentage of the voters are farmers, are manual laborers, it's much easier to sort of get people to agree to welfare schemes and protectionist programs. I'm going to define middle class in some detail in a little bit. When you start getting clerical workers, professional workers, basically people who are largely in a non-unionized sectors, then these sorts of demands become less important. And other sorts of demands have to be made, often social demands. The second thing that happens is that all across Western Europe and the United States in particular, you see a kind of retrenchment, a kind of conservative backlash against a large amount of social change in terms of accepting homosexuality, social change in terms of accepting gender, social change in terms of various sorts of rights among people who aren't married. And so this leads to a sort of a very conservative backlash. Now, when we think about conservative backlashes, there's something else that needs to be made clear. So when a country sort of is running by itself and nobody has any problems, we don't need to articulate who institutions benefit. But at the moment that I make the argument, I need to take back institutions. I then now need to make the argument for whom are the institutions most important? Who should be benefiting from institutions and who is sort of left out of them? And this is the kind of politics that has been taking place slowly over the last sort of 5, 10, 15 years. Okay. So I'm going to run this very quickly because there's sort of a lot to cover. I'm going to talk about the American case to explain this theory. I'm going to show, I think, pretty definitively with the data that this is not an economic grievance story. This is the rise of ethnic politics, right? This is the rise of race and ethnic politics and ethnic polarization. That is what's driving these electoral outcomes and probably electoral outcomes in UK, France, etc. The second thing I talked about, I'll show that that's very much true in the US. You have the rise of a large middle class in the United States. I'll explain that there are a number of structural factors that make the US, in this particular case, particularly susceptible to this form of nativism. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the historical origins and the structure of race and nativism in the United States. So I'm sort of going to sort of give, you will see that I took this Beyond Trump to heart. After this, I won't be mentioning Trump very much until the last 2 slides. I'm much more interested in the social and political formation that sort of lead to a Trump. So, this is a map that came out of the New York Times. That stuff there that is dark green are places where Trump, the Republican nominee this time, outperformed Mitt Romney, the Republican nominee last time. Okay. Next map are places, the darker green are places with very, very large white populations. The more white the population, the darker the green. Now, one doesn't need to be a serious statistician to see that there's a very, very strong relationship. One can do regression, one can do everything. The relationship is visually pretty striking, right? There's a very strong relationship between where a lot of white people live and where Trump got a lot of votes. And more votes than the Republicans have ever gotten in those places. Now, what we have started to spend a lot of time analyzing in the US are these states right here. These states are what are called the Rust Belt. They're the old sort of manufacturing core of the United States. As job automation and globalization have taken place, a lot of these jobs have sort of gone away. And that's led to a lot of economic depression. And so this has led to a large debate about what is the relationship between this kind of economic depression and the sort of outcomes that we're seeing and globalization and so on. What I'm going to sort of say is there is a role for globalization, but this is not a simple economic grievance story, and there are lots of reasons that I'll show you why it's not. But at the end of the day, we need to understand why nativism is happening. So nativism is an outcome of a process, not the explanation. And part of that explanation is a changing economic environment. Okay. This is another graph. Now these are from exit polls in the New York Times, so they may not be perfectly numerically accurate, but they're picking up pretty general trends. So the white population without a college degree, what we will from here on define, and most political scientists define as white working class, are white without a college degree. You'll see in 2004 there was already a pretty large advantage for Republicans, but by the time we get here in this particular election, this is from last election to this election, we have a huge jump, right? Almost a 20 percentage point, 15 percentage point jump, right? in support for Donald Trump and the Republicans. So that says that these kinds of natives appeals are doing very well with whites without a college degree. Whites with a college degree are moving the other way. Now, to make this sort of more striking, we can break this down by income, as the New York Times has also done. Right? This is no longer white and non-white. This is just everyone in the population. Poor people are becoming more Republican. Richer people are becoming less Republican. Okay? But it is still the case that the poorer you are, the more likely you are to vote Democrat. Right? It is not the case. It is not class conflict, because class conflict would mean all of the poor people went over here and all the rich people went over there. That's not what happened. What this is it's suggesting that the kind of appeals that are being made in the political system are cross-cutting. Right? So it's not enhancing class conflict, it's diminishing, it's something that's sort of orthogonal or orthogonal to our standard sort of class. And what I'm going to try to argue is that nativism is a kind of political appeal that needs to be understood on its own. It is not just simply something we can understand in terms of economy. And here's something that can sort of explain this in some more detail. So this is the only data that I have run for this talk. So what I've done is I've pulled out data from the American National Election Survey and the last numbers from the New York Times, because the last round hasn't been done. So the blue line here is the share of the Democratic vote in the entire electorate. And the green is for the white working class. That's white without a college degree. So our first story that this would be some sort of economic depression story would be, well, this is happening because of globalization. But look where the drop happens. The first time we see it is in 1964. It is 1964, 1968. So any American history buffs in there that know what happened around that time, why this happened? Civil rights. It's civil rights. So the reality is, this is actually after Nixon. This is a weird election, but after that, it's back to normal. Then again, polarization starts growing again the moment you have a black president. So this theory that the white working class moved because of globalization doesn't hold true. In fact, we see that it happens at two pretty obvious points in time, and they both have to do with race. And part of trying to understand why the white working class vote is the way that it is that for a large number of reasons, the white seems to be more operational than the working class. Okay, so now to the next part, right? So I think let me just sort of actually, to really sort of make this point clear, because that's you can tell the one question I don't want is, isn't this just globalization, right? Okay, so Obama is from the Midwest. He engineered an $80 billion bailout for automotive industries, spending a lot of his own political capital. He spent a lot of his own political capital to start nationalized healthcare. It is exactly this population, the population that we would think from economic grievance, that cares the most about it. Remember that the states that voted against him are exactly the states that benefit from the automotive industry. It's exactly this population that you think would be the most happy, but they're the most angry. So that tells you that it isn't a pure economic story. You can't just sort of give them socialist goals or welfare programs and make them happy. That's not how this is working. There's something else going on. So this is some data from actually the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but these are the two authors that sort of compiled it. And I'm just going to show you very, very quickly that around World War II, you're at around 5% of professionals. Now you're 25%. Around 1940, you're around 6% of service workers. Now it's 14%. Here it's around 10%, and now it's up around 20%. So basically, we're going from 25 to 30% of the population being white-collar workers to around 60%. So thinking about why the working class coalition and working class politics sort of falls apart, the numbers simply aren't there, right? And this is a phenomenon you see all across Europe, right? You have UK having new Labour, you have the Democrats shifting under Bill Clinton, in the continent, in political science, we study post-materialist politics, Green Party show up, right? So people start caring more about the environment, about social issues, and less about welfare programs and uses, right? That is sort of a shift that has happened all across the country. And this is the reason why. This particular demographic transition has happened all across Western Europe. Okay. So the second structural explanation I want to talk about is the Electoral College. This has garnered a lot of attention because as we speak, it seems that Hillary Clinton will win the national vote by about 2 percentage points, but will actually lose quite badly in the Electoral College. And that shows that there's some disproportionality there. And that's something that's been known for a while. Smaller states have more electoral votes per voter, and Hillary has done disproportionately well in very big states like New York and California, where voters are weaker. But that's actually not the biggest issue with the electoral vote system. I mean, I think that's one thing that grabs our attention. The big issue is that there's a winner-take-all system. So the winner-take-all system means that a state is allotted a certain number of electoral votes, 2, 5, 15, 20, 25, 55, right? Now, the way that it works is whomever wins that state, outside of 2 states, those are outside, gets all of the electoral votes. So what it means is, if I am a resident of California in the United States. In California, there was no doubt that Hillary Clinton was going to win, which meant there was no reason for either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump to care about California during the campaign. Increasing turnout a little bit for one person or another does nothing for their electoral fortunes. What that means is that the election is completely decided by issues and demographics in the swing states. And I just told you the swing state system with a Rust Belt. And I just showed you where all the white people were. So you can start seeing how this is sort of happening, right? That even if the entire electorate doesn't look like that, effectively the part of the electorate that matters for deciding the election, your question, is a very white population in the Midwest. There's a third structural formation that has taken place in the United States, and I'm going to come back to this in a second. There's a huge amount of partisan polarization. What this means is that despite all of the Bernie Sanders stuff, all the Republicans coming out against Donald Trump, still you have 90% of Democrats voting for Hillary Clinton and 90% of Republicans voting for Donald Trump. That's been true for a while, actually. This election is no different than any other election when it comes to partisan polarization. This is just something that has been, again, these are exit poll numbers, but this is going to hold. This has been happening for a long time. So, in my last 5 minutes, I want to sort of talk about stuff that I've talked about in my pieces. I'll talk about less today. But there's a historical development for nativism in the US. And to go back and try to understand where it comes from, it's helpful to look at the 1964 election. The 1964 election pitted Lyndon Baines Johnson, the Democratic Party, against Barry Goldwater, the Republican Party. Barry Goldwater was a very Trump-like figure. He was against civil rights legislation, and he was backed by something called the John Birch Society. John Birch Society was a hyper-paranoid organization that was opposed to civil rights because they believed that the black population was working with the Soviets to create a Negro-Soviet republic. Those are exact words. Just like what we've seen today, the John Birch Society had turned against Republicans. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the Republican president, was called a Soviet spy. This was a very powerful movement, and they are the ones who backed it. And just like Donald Trump, Barry Goldwater had come through a multi-corner primary. So we have this, we've sort of seen this before, this sort of rise of extremely paranoid politics, nativism, against civil rights, so on and so forth. But something happened that was very different in this election. Nelson Rockefeller, who was the moderate voice of the Republican Party and governor of New York, kind of like what happened against Donald Trump, said, we really can't vote for this guy. This guy is crazy. And more than 20% of the Republicans actually voted for Lyndon Baines Johnson. So what ended up happening is that LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, won by 23 percentage points in this election. And Goldwater only won 6 states. 5 of them were in the South because they were both civil rights, and 1 was his home state of Arizona. So it was a complete destruction. LBJ used this political capital to start the civil rights legislation. So this is actually the moment when civil rights starts. 1965 is when the U.S. opens its doors to immigration. My father immigrated to the U.S. in 1967 as a result of this. Trump is another example of this phenomenon coming back. This sort of paranoid style of politics, except this time he won. And what is the catalyst this time? Last time the catalyst was civil rights for black people. This time, the catalyst was Obama. The origins of the Tea Party are murky. We're not exactly sure how they started, but it's pretty clear that they gained power within a year after Obama being elected. And the Tea Party is exactly that group of people who started bringing these conspiracies back in. Obama is a Muslim, Obama is not born in the United States, and Trump actually comes to power on exactly this context. Incidentally, he propagated the word Burker to say, to talk about Obama not being born in the United States. People who were part of the John Birch Society were Birchers. So there is a direct allusion, actually, to that phenomenon. But you can see that this kind of movement created a mass paranoia against Obama, against what Obama stood for. Still, just a year ago, when Trump was in campaign mode, more than half of the people voting for Trump still believed that Obama was Muslim. Before the election, 70% of Republicans, I should say Republicans, would have believed the polls were rigged if Trump had lost, right? I mean, so it's sort of mass paranoia that is going on. You feel like you're losing power in a system. If today, if I want to sort of say this in Indian terms, right? If today there was a Dalit prime minister, you would see a clawback among certain upper caste communities. You would. And this is a very similar sort of thing. You have a white population that believes that it's on the top of the social hierarchy. It sees certain things slipping away. It sees conservatism in terms of religion slipping away. It sees its racial superiority slipping away, and this is how one sort of counteracts this. And this is an argument you see elsewhere. One of the things we don't talk about in Brexit is actually not just Scotland and Northern Ireland, but even down to the constituency level, Catholic areas voted against Brexit and Protestant areas voted for Brexit. So these sort of identity issues don't go away just because we try to paper over them. There's often a conservative background. There are a group of people who deeply identify with these identities, and at times it leads to these sorts of conservative backlash. So I just want to end with a couple of final thoughts. So one, I haven't talked about this, but all of these guys, Nigel Farage in Brexit, so a lot of people backing Donald Trump, have actually come out of the libertarian movement. There is becoming a striking relationship between a certain model of libertarianism and nativism. And it's a complete flip from 100 years ago. When we think of National Socialism, we think of ethnic nationalism and socialistic policies and welfare policies, right? And so we have to start thinking about what is this connection. I mean, my sort of working hypothesis is that a very aggressive form of libertarianism believes in minimal government to such a degree that effectively, they often use the word the gang should rule the system. Now, to them, that's egalitarianism. But if you're a dominant group, that's the perfect world. If you have all the guns and you have all the muscle and you can control the system, then you want a world with very few rules. A dominant group sees, a Brahmin zamindar sees the government is the one who's taken away land, the government is the one who's imposed reservations. In the US, they see a Supreme Court that has sort of moved the needle further in terms of civil rights, and that's not something that the majority population has to do. There's some sort of two open questions. A lot of people ask me, because I work on Indian politics, obviously, what will relations be like with India? Nobody knows. I think there is an angle for India to win vis-a-vis Pakistan. So there is a bizarre world in which you can see relations getting better, but there should be no bones about this. In a number of circumstances, a number of people named to the cabinet have made explicitly anti-Indian and anti-Indian American remarks. The chief strategist, Stephen Bannon, has explicitly said that he is bothered by the number of Indian American CEOs in Silicon Valley. The Trump movement has started a false campaign against Indra in Pepsi and started boycotting her and massively hit their stock. So we shouldn't, whether or not strategic interests happen to align from time to time, we shouldn't mistake this for what it is. The final thing I want to sort of talk about, and this is a pet peeve of mine, is India has a unique ability to shoot itself in the foot when it comes to bringing back human capital. So one of the famous stories I've heard from other people, and there are people here in the bureaucracy, so they probably know this as well. When the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of their scientists were saying, well, we'd be willing to come to India, you have to pay us double the bureaucratic salary. And India said, no, we're not doing it. Today again, in the UK and the US, you have a lot of Indians who would be willing to come back to the US for basic investments. You could create 40 Bangalores tomorrow, right? But let's see if political will is
there. Professor Parthasarathy, Dr. Sarkar, ladies and gentlemen. Let me at the outset convey my heartfelt thanks to Professor Agnihotri and the Center for Policy Studies, IIT, for having invited me here for this particular seminar. I'm glad to be here, and it is in fact almost customary to say that I'm honored to be in IIT. There are two things about IIT that continue to amuse me since the day I was a college student myself. I said amuse, not really fascinate. The two things are, people here are rather tech savvy, doesn't suit me. I'm not going to make a PowerPoint presentation today. And second thing is that it's a fairly, over 30 years it must have changed, I'm sure, and I can actually see this in the audience as well. But it continues to be a fairly male-dominated society, again, something. And yet I'm happy to be here this particular seminar. I'm also happy that Professor Agnihotri asked Dr. Sarkar to make a presentation before mine, because there are a few things which he said with solid mathematical proof, and I'm glad that he said those things before I started saying something, because probably we were going to go on a similar trail. And Dr. Sarkar, thank you, because that helps me streamline my talk further. Let me just mention those things where I tend to agree with Dr. Sarkar and then go on to my own presentation. Yes, on one point that Trump phenomena is not entirely economic, not entirely due to globalization. There are other factors which lead into the rise of people like Trump in the US. Second thing is, there are systemic issues with the US electoral process, particularly the system of winner-take-all. The other thing I would like to have agreement with Dr. Sarkar is in terms of partisan divisions. A lot of people have said that there has been polarization during this particular election. But in terms of partisan polarization in the United States, I've always tended to believe that US was always partisan polarized. So this particular election does not seem to be any different from the previous elections. And I'm also in agreement entirely with the argument about libertarianism on the one hand and nativism on the other hand, the linkages between the two. So quickly coming to my own presentation, where Professor Agnihotri has termed it as US election and beyond, but I'm also going to take it not just beyond Trump, I'm actually going to take it even beyond United States. Let me therefore begin with one argument that has fascinated me for the day since Trump got elected. And I have been making this argument to my own students, so let me share it with you people as well. People are trying to draw similarities between Brexit and the rise of Trump, or Marine Le Pen and the rise of Trump, and so on. I found a very interesting similarity between a completely different politician in a completely different part of the world, and that politician is an Asian politician. And I'm making a reference to the former Prime Minister of Thailand. Some of you might have heard about him, some of you probably haven't, and that is Thaksin Shinawatra. Fascinating similarities, and let me just say how they are similar. Trump and Shinawatra. Both of them have been businessmen. While Trump has a real estate empire, Thaksin had an empire into mobile phones. And they were billionaires when they actually entered politics. Despite the fact that they were themselves businessmen, they actually prospered on a vote bank, as we use the Indian terminology for the same. They prospered on a vote bank that came from the semi-urban or rural masses, which were actually not rich classes. They were neither middle classes, they actually came from the lower middle classes in both the societies. So Thaksin's supporters actually came from rural Thailand, especially the northeast and northwestern Thailand, and they were actually rural masses, lower middle class. Similarly, you see Trump's supporters, as shown by Dr. Sarkar, they belong to a particular class which is lower than the American middle class as such. They also, in a way, represent somebody, they're representing somebody outside the establishment. So as far as Trump is concerned, he is completely outside, a complete outsider to the Washington establishment, just as Thaksin was a complete outsider to the Bangkok establishment when he actually became the Prime Minister of Thailand. And another similarity between the two leaders has been the fact that economic grievances of the people and economic situation in the country has actually propelled the rise of both the leaders. So you see the rise of Thaksin in the backdrop of the Asian financial crisis, which took place in around 97-98, and the financial crisis in fact began in Thailand and spread across Asia. Thaksin got elected under the first democratic constitution in the year 2000, and he was the first and the only Prime Minister of Thailand who got re-elected in a democratic way again in the year 2006. A lot of similarity in the rise as such. Today, Trump is capitalizing on the fact that there is a disgruntled lower middle class in the American society, which is not very happy with the economic situation, and that has a lot of similarity with Thaksin. Thaksin, of course, had to quit under a lot of allegations, especially of corruption and other things, scandals, of course. But there are a few achievements of Thaksin that we should remember, and these achievements, in fact, are in the form of the populist economic program that he gave to his country. One of the things is that he brought in reforms in agriculture in Thailand. Second important thing that he did in Thailand was he supported the small and medium enterprises in the Thai economy. That actually was a reason why Thaksin government was able to reduce poverty in northeast Thailand in a great way. So the rural masses under those 5 or 6 years were uplifted out of poverty because of the populist programs that Thaksin ran in his own country. But he also has some other achievements to his credit, and one of them is while Thailand had taken a loan from the IMF during the financial crisis, with Thaksin as the Prime Minister, Thailand was able to repay the loan 2 years ahead of the schedule. And these are the things that we must keep in mind when we discuss the Trump phenomena as well as the vis-a-vis the Thaksin phenomena as such. Why do I talk about somebody like Thaksin? And that gets me to the second question that I want to deal in this particular presentation. Often the rise of Trump is regarded as another expression of the rise of right all over the world. And I sort of want to question this particular formation that this is the rise of right all over the world. And looking at Thaksin phenomenon, comparing it to Trump will help me understand Trump going beyond the only understanding of the rise of right as such. My question, and I actually am confronted with a lot of questions which I am posing here. Does Trump represent the right? Actually, he doesn't have any coherent ideology, so to speak. It's very difficult to classify him as either right or the left. Because on the one hand, he talks about tax cuts and protectionism, which may be regarded as right. But on the other hand, he also talks about spending on infrastructure, and that is actually not right. So it is something very similar to the leftist economic ideology. You increase the government spending on infrastructure. So the question remains unanswered, and it will be answered only when we see 1 year of Trump as the President of America to be able to answer whether it is a righteous president in power or a leftist president in power. Let us go beyond Trump and the US and ask questions about Brexit, Marine Le Pen, and people like that all across Europe. You know, interestingly, a few days back, immediately after Trump's election, I got a text message from a friend. I talked about tech savviness, and I consider myself a technological juvenile because I don't use any social media. So people who want to communicate to me are forced to send me either a text message or make a direct call. I received a text message from a former sociology professor who used to be my friend, and she asked me in that text message, are the days of democracy and market economy over? I just flashed a very curt and small message saying that no. So she flashed another message back to me saying that no, the doubts are because Trumps all over are getting elected. And I fail to understand how does the rise of Trump end the days of democracy, capitalism, and market economy? And this particular confusion has been created. I have no idea whether it is deliberate or it is out of ignorance or it is out of, this entire confusion about right and left. What is right, what is left? Whether Trump represents right, whether Brexit represents right, whether Marine Le Pen represents right. There seems to be entire, I would call it conceptual confusion. When I interact with my MA students in the class, I took them to task by saying that you have not learned the basics of political science when you come to my graduate class and sit here, but that confusion actually seems to be existing in the entire society. Let me ask you a few questions related to that. When Brexit happened, we heard the commentaries from even some well-known people. We heard a commentary that this is the rise of the left, rise of the right. If Brexit is right, and Brexit is expression against globalization, do we say globalization is left? When Dunkel draft was presented and I was a young lecturer in a Mumbai college, we were used to hearing a hammering from the left intellectuals in India that Dunkel draft, globalization, WTO, all is the expression of neoliberal right. And suddenly now we hear the talk of Brexit being right, and then we are confused when we ask the question, oh, if Brexit is an expression against globalization, does it mean globalization is left? It is not. Where does it come from? And that is where I find your point of libertarianism and nativism and the nexus between the two very interesting. Because, where does it come from? Let me put it in more clear terms. Because Brexit, Trump, Marine Le Pen may be right, but the opposite of it is not left. Brexit, Marine Le Pen, and Donald Trump actually represent what we can call cultural right, vis-a-vis what today we can see as the economic right. So it's not actually between the left and the right, it's actually between two different brands of right. One is the cultural right, the other is economic right. What has happened is in the developed countries today, masses are okay with, people are okay with economic integration. They have no issue with goods and services and finance crossing the borders. But they have an issue, they have a major issue indeed with people crossing the border. They have an issue with migration. So they are not against economic integration. They are not the left in India who would say globalization is an expression of neo-colonialism or it is the expression of neoliberalism. They are fine with economic integration, but they are not fine with migration. And that is where we can see, this schism sort of between a cultural right on the one hand and economic right on the other hand. I wish to invite your attention to a report. In fact, it has been published as a book. Branko Milanovic is the author. I haven't, unfortunately been able to lay my hand at the book as such, but I have read Milanovic's articles which are based on this particular report. And the book is titled Global Inequality, a New Approach for the Age of Globalization, where Milanovic's statistics that he presents, and as I said, I'm not a mathematician like Dr. Sarkar, but there's a little statistics that even a layperson like me can understand. The statistics that Milanovic presents in this in the articles that I have read, he talks to us about a period between 1986 and 2016. I'm sorry, 1986 and 2016, where he claims that income distribution in the world has changed in such a way that about 1 billion, in fact over 1 billion, he says 1.2 or something billion people have been lifted out of poverty in the emerging economies. Some 1.2 billion people being lifted out of poverty in the past 30 years in the emerging economies that include China, India, Southeast Asia and East Asia. It is the same period, same 30-year period between 86 and 2006, where the incomes of the class which was on par with the one that we are talking about in the developing countries. In 86, there were two classes which were comparable to each other, one in the developed countries and the other in the developing countries. While in the developing countries, that class has seen real rise of income. In the developed countries, the same class is stagnated to where they were 30 years back. And this is the glaring data that he has pointed out, which shows, please don't misunderstand me in terms of the statistics, because the lifting out of poverty of the masses in the emerging economies is getting them to the level of, say, about $10 to $15 income per day, which is still lower than the poverty line in many developed countries. But that is not actually the point. The point that Milanovic is trying to make is, while in one part of the world people have seen rise in the income, in another part of the world they have seen stagnation of income. And if you were looking at the presentation of Dr. Sarkar, it is that particular class whose income has stagnated has voted for Donald Trump. Rustics, he was mentioning to. Those who have lost their manufacturing base, he was mentioning to. And the support for the Trump phenomena, whether it is in the US or in the Europe, actually comes from this particular class. So it's important to understand that income distribution in the world has changed. In fact, I many times have, just because words fascinate us, I like to put it in this manner, that the process of globalization for past about 50 years has changed the definitions of North and South. It has also changed the contours of North and South. And that, what we can see perhaps is that within the erstwhile South, we can see some North emerging. And within the erstwhile North, we can see some South emerging. And this emerging South in the North, that is responsible for the rise of phenomena like Trump or Marine Le Pen or Brexit. In the end, let me just tackle this question, because I actually want to tackle it. Foreign policy is my subject of research, and that's why I would like to dwell on this particular question in a little more detail. I'll finish in 5 minutes. what will be the impact of Trump on India? This is a question that you raised, and you gave one very interesting answer to bring the non-resident Indians back to India. That may be an opportunity. But this particular impact for the budding IITians may probably not like. But let me give some other. I agree with Dr. Sarkar. It's too early to call which way Trump will go. One, because he doesn't have any coherent foreign policy expression. He has been making remarks on both the sides. Secondly, also because he still hasn't put a team in place. So let's wait till he has a Secretary of State, a Secretary of Defense, a Secretary of Homeland Security, etc., etc. He hasn't made that choice. And therefore, I would like to wait and watch. However, I have two propositions which I often make, and which when I make them, I always run in trouble, because most people like to take an issue with it. My first proposition is that a Republican American president is always better for India than a Democratic president. Immediately people attack me by saying, so what about Nixon? And I say Nixon is an exception that proves the rule. But a Republican American president has always proved better for India than a Democratic president. Problem with Trump, however, is that he is an un-Republican Republican. And we therefore have to wait and watch. But in many ways, I can see there will be a good impact as well as bad impact. I will have to be wary as an Indian if Trump cancels the nuclear deal with Iran. Because the next question will be what happens to our nuclear deal with the United States. But there are some good things. I mean, if Trump wants to tear into pieces the Trans-Pacific Partnership, why should India care for it? In fact, India should be more happy, because in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, India is not a member, it doesn't have any role. And if TPP actually takes place, India's Asia-Pacific role will be severely curtailed. So if Trump is going to tear it off into pieces, I think as Indians we should be happy. More important question, and this is where I would like to actually stop. The more important question is, do we want to believe, like many liberal-minded, good-hearted Americans, that an isolationist America is really bad for the world? And that's the question I want to leave you with. I just want to say that it's not easy for a president-elect to translate all the promises made in the electoral campaign. Obama also has not been able to translate Guantanamo Bay into reality. And therefore, as Indians, let's hope that Trump is not able to translate into reality, translate into policy most of the promises that he has made to the American people. I'll stop here, and thanks for your patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both the speakers. I think both of them were a little too academic in saying the right things, especially in saying that it's too early to tell. I remember Chairman Mao was once asked, apparently, his views on the French Revolution, and he said it's too early to tell. And therefore, I'm not sure if this was actually the right time to have this event, or maybe we should have had it 50 years down the line. There's a lot of, I'm one of those, I belong to the breed of ignorant, confused sociologists that you referred to. So I feel even less capable to chair this session, but I wish to thank you for the great deal of theoretical clarity and the empirical evidence that you brought to bear on the large-scale confusions that surround our understanding, perceptions of what has happened in the US. So we are also, I think, constrained by the fact that much of what we hear is secondhand from the American media and from other sources. And therefore, whether we as laypersons or as more serious scholars of what has happened, we need this kind of clarity. I think that was one of the purposes of organizing this event, so that we are able to differentiate between, as you said, the cultural right and the economic right, and also to understand the causes and the factors that led to the Trump victory on the basis of solid empirical evidence. I was just told by a colleague before I came here that one of our ministers has referred to our beloved Prime Minister as the Karl Marx of India. So what does that make him? So which means that Amit Shah is probably the Frederick Engels of India. So it's very important that, whether we are talking about one's own society or other societies, we be very clear about what we are actually referring to, because one can't get caught up in the rhetoric. So the floor is now open for questions, and so please be as brief as possible so that we can get more questions. And please also let us know if the question is addressed to a particular speaker or to both speakers.
My hands technology didn't work. Let's get quick. I go back to 77 and our hopes were fizzled out in a matter of months. So I don't need to wait for 15 years. I'll predict right now, Donald Trump isn't going to make too much of a difference. Because this is a negative vote and the basic understanding of the economy is lacking. Now I do agree that there is opposition to migration. That's simply because migration is visible. The disadvantages of trade are not visible. By far bigger disadvantages are in technology. And nobody has thought of challenging or addressing these. So unless somebody challenges these basics, the condition of the Americans is not going to improve. And I don't expect anything big to happen. We'll yawn for 4 years and nothing else is going to happen. And about your point regarding Obama's, Obama being a Muslim, they elected him twice. So saying that 54% doesn't go far, the question is how many thought of it before they elected him and how many thought of it after they elected him. Thanks everybody.
We'll take one more question, then we'll take 3 questions, then we'll allow the panel to answer. We have another lot of questions. The person right at the back there had raised his hand before.
Let me get the mic to work.
Yeah.
And just shout.
The mic works.
I'm Siddharth Chaudhary, I teach in the Computer Science department. So this question is more for Dr. Sarkar. And so I very much identify with what Dr. Sahasrabuddhe said about the North developing Southern aspects, right? And following up on what you said a moment ago, I think I want to call out your statistics a little bit, right? So you presented this aggregate statistics of the white vote share decreasing for Obama and said that in the white working class phrase, white is more important than working class. And I don't think the statistics actually holds up to that. I mean, first of all, as you very correctly observed, those same voters elected Obama twice. He swept the Rust Belt states. He lost the white vote in the South, but not in the North, right? So there's a strong support for him. Trump got less of the white vote than Romney did. And finally, in this election, 43% of the electorate didn't turn out to vote. So in some sense, it's more that Clinton, for whatever reasons and whatever other factors we can bring into this, could not get the same people, the Democratic base and the white working class base, to come out and vote for her in the way that they had come out and voted for Obama. So while I'm completely willing to acknowledge that, and it's obvious that racism and misogyny are rife in the American political and civic discourse, I don't think you can draw this immediate characterization of the white working class as voting because of the white part more than the working class part. And I don't think your aggregate statistics based on percentages really conveys that.
Can we have one more question here?
My question is actually on a very similar lines compared to the first one, also to Dr. Sarkar. Actually, if we look at the electoral result in general, I would kind of agree that nativism and cultural rightism have led to...
Can you hold the mic a little farther?
Have led to the benefit of Donald Trump and the Republican Party in this election. Although, if we actually look at the Democratic primaries itself and the way Bernie Sanders managed to garner so much support, especially in those same Rust Belt states that Hillary actually has won,
could we say that the election result in terms of the popular vote and Donald Trump's populism is a result of nativism, but as far as the actual electoral college results, especially in the states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, could that be more a result of Donald Trump's anti-NAFTA, anti-TPP policies, which were similar to Bernie Sanders, who won those states even in the primaries, rather than actual nativism or racism as such?
I'll let the panel respond, but then the talk is titled Beyond Trump. So we actually don't want to talk much about the victory. So maybe we can also have questions about the other aspects that I talked about beyond the victory of Trump. Yes, can
you I think that one of the big open questions, and I agree with you, is who is that voter who votes for Obama and then is a part of Trump's coalition, right? And what are the set of political appeals that a person is responding to that says, I want to vote for Obama, but whatever it is that Obama had, Hillary doesn't have it, but Trump has it, right? So one answer that you can give here is that Mitt Romney, who was Obama's opponent last time, did not use the same political mobilization tactics and did not use the same rhetoric. I mean, the question at the end of the day is, how does somebody like Obama fare when he is up against somebody who is explicitly playing the race card in politics? And that's a counterfactual we don't know. But what we do know is that in the last election, what no one talks about was that was actually the largest white vote gap we've had since the civil rights era as well. So it was actually already happening. And the move actually happens not in this election, it happened in the last election because the Tea Party comes after Obama's first election.
But that's in the South, right?
No,
More in the South than the North, because the gap in the Rust Belt, Obama won the Rust Belt and he got a substantial fraction of the white vote.
So he got a substantial fraction of the white vote, but he still lost the white vote, right? And so, those graphs I'm showing you, those are, even if you break them down state by state, it isn't as if Obama is decreasing the white gap in these places. What's going on is that there is enough of the other vote to balance it out. Now, look, I mean, I think I freely admit, I think everyone freely admits that that particular voter is a peculiar voter, right? We don't know, ultimately I can make assumptions about what that person is doing, you can make assumptions about what that person is doing. But when you have such aggregate statistics, if it is purely a working class vote, then it's something that should cut across race, right? So if there is something that only appeals to a certain ethnic group and not another, then you have to start wondering, well, what is so different in this appeal versus other appeals? And so, I mean, I think that's the best answer I can give, and that, without individual level data, which is not data that exists at the moment, I don't think that we can give good, concrete, empirical answers to that question. On the question of, what, the Bernie effect, I mean, I think that was there, right? I mean, I think that, Hillary represented an economic view that frustrated the working class. But actually, I think Hillary won Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken. But no, she lost. She won. She lost Michigan, but I thought she won Pennsylvania.
She lost both the primaries as well as. If I'm not wrong.
She lost Pennsylvania. But I mean, so yeah, I mean, so this is. I mean, of course, those frustrations were there, right? I mean, I don't think. But the question is that economic vote something that you can see explicitly in the data? And does it make sense if the party that has given you an auto bailout and nationalized healthcare, no one doubts Hillary is a nationalized healthcare person, that is not the person you vote for, right? What are the things that are moving against a candidate on that front?
Yes, I see one hand here, one there, two there, and one here. So we will take one here, and then the two.
Hello.
Yes.
I'll be asking a question now on maybe Professor Sahasrabuddhe will answer on civic. So Donald Trump's main campaign motto was "Make America Great Again," and nobody knows what that means. So you just impose whatever you think about it into that. So. And similarly, during the Brexit campaign, there was a campaign bus on which there was written 350 million, or I think billion or million euros that goes to the EU will be into NHS, National Health Service. So, but that was not true. So my question is my question is about citizens. So how does a citizen who is regularly fed with all these kind of things, how does a citizen filter this out? What does it tell about our citizenry, our democracy, and how it is evolving despite all the globalization and technological progress? So, and how are we progressing with reference to all these things?
Thank you. Professor Reddy, we'll take the mic there, and then we'll move those two questions.
Thank you, Professor Sahasrabuddhe and Professor Dr. Sarkar. My question is that very often we are confused about what is left and what is right, because the impacts of globalization affect different stakeholders differently. If you are a consumer, you benefit by globalization. If you are a producer, again, there are two categories: those who can withstand competition prefer globalization, and those who cannot withstand competition, they are not comfortable with globalization, and therefore different people term effects of globalization differently. I think from an economist's point of view, whether you open the goods market or whether you open the labor market, the effects are the same. Maybe some are, the first is not visible because people are not crossing borders, and you don't see people who have taken away your jobs. Whereas in the case of migration, you can visibly see them, and therefore there is more resentment. So is this all political game played on the ignorance of the voters, that they don't understand the effects of globalization so clearly, and that is why these kind of confusions take place?
We'll take two questions there.
Hello, my question is a fairly simple one. I think we all can agree that the results might have been different in absence of the current system of the Electoral College. We can also agree that the president who does get elected tends to forget why he got elected. So my question is, how fair do you think the system is, and will America ever come about to change the Electoral College?
Okay, we are running out of time, so what I will do is, I see two more hands up, so we'll have the panel respond to these two, then take those two final questions, and then we'll close.
The US isn't going to change the electoral system because the small states can block it.
Right, so let me try and answer some of these questions which were asked. Messages like "Make America Great Again," how do they translate to the voters? If I have understood your question right. You said they again are "Make America Great Again" are what Dr. Sarkar was using, and if I use the lexicon that he was using, these are nativist appeals, and they are translated as nativist. So, whether America becomes great may or may not matter to the people who vote for Trump. But that here is a person who stands for the white Protestant people matters to them more. So it actually translates as, if I'm using the correct words to describe that, if it translates as making America great means let us dump multiculturalism for a while, let us dump globalization for a while. Let us start looking inward. Let us start getting the manufacturing job inside the US. And many of these things may mean to different people, right? So it's not a uniform message that carries to everybody, but everybody tries to interpret. And it is in this context, I will link it to the question of Madam that, in fact, you made a comment, and I was actually a little puzzled by that comment, and that's primarily why. I would not call, as a political scientist, I would not say that voters are ignorant. In fact, they are smarter than what we think of them. And if we study Indian politics, I think Neelanjan will agree with me that if we study Indian politics, we know that the rural illiterate voter is far more smart than you and I sitting here in this particular auditorium as such. Coming to that second question of you, Madam, impact of globalization, etc., etc. If I have understood the question right, because I was actually not sure whether I'm getting it right. Problem of political communication after all. So as I understand it, people where they're not crossing the boundaries here, but the fact is, jobs, manufacturing jobs in the emerging economies are on the rise, and they are on the decline in the developed world. So that message is very clear to the people in the developed world that those who are sitting in Bangkok or Jakarta or Kuala Lumpur or Beijing or Shanghai or Kunming are taking away my jobs. They don't say Delhi, because Delhi is actually not taking away their jobs. But certainly these people, in the emerging economy, are taking away the white middle class jobs from the US. And I'm tempted to answer this question on Electoral College beyond what Dr. Sarkar has already said. The American political system believes in protecting. They have this is a different way of American style